Good morning. Good morning, Stephen. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I would like to welcome everybody on behalf of two Vienna-based organizations, Forum Journalismus und Medien and Presseclub Concordia. The first one is a training center for journalists, and the second one, the oldest press center in the world. Our today's topic is understanding contemporary Russian propaganda narrative. Professor Hutchings is a professor of Professor Stephen Hutchings is a professor of Russian Studies at the University of Manchester and fellow at the UK's Academy of Social Sciences. Let me also introduce myself, and then I'll talk a bit more about Professor Hutchings. My name is Mirjana Tomic. I host and moderate seminars on politics and media in Europe for the two before mentioned Vienna-based organizations, Film and Presseclub Concordia. On 17th of March, the Russian Federation holds elections. When the elections results are known in advance, the outcome of the war in Ukraine, the long impact of Western sanctions, Russia's isolation, and repressive domestic measures cannot be anticipated with certainty. And as we all know, information and propaganda are essential components of the Kremlin regime. And this importance has not started with Vladimir Putin. Information and propaganda are important for all regimes, by the way. With international focus on Kremlin's information or disinformation campaign addressing foreign audiences, I would like to focus on the narrative for the domestic audience. Propaganda is not a new phenomenon, but what is new and what is old, and how does Kremlin conduct it? We would like Professor Hutchings to explain. During communism, citizens were prepared for a better future while sacrificing the present. What are they prepared for now? Is there a clear objective? Professor Hutchings has been studying Russian propaganda, media, and culture for decades. He has published 8 monographs and 6 edited volumes on various aspects of Russian cultural media and propaganda studies, as well as many, and he has published numerous articles in professional journals. Stephen has advised government departments, media monitoring organizations, and journalists on different aspects of Russian state communication strategy. He was the president of the British Association for Slavonic and Eastern European Studies from 2010 to 2013. What is the format today? The format will be, I will have a talk with Professor Hutchings for about 30 minutes, and then we open the floor for questions. We shall be recording this event, and we shall post it on YouTube later on. When you ask questions, you're very welcome to turn on your camera, and now maybe it is easier if you turn off your camera. As we have read, Russia is placing a lot of importance on information and propaganda. It's not only for media, it is also films, it is also series, sending out different messages. So let's start immediately by asking the experts. Stephen, you have been studying Russian propaganda for decades, Cold War, transition, Putin era, war. Do you notice a continuum or a radical disruption in techniques and narratives? Please, Stephen, the floor or the screen is yours.
I'm going to become like a broken record, and probably for each question you ask, I'm going to begin by saying it's a complex picture.
Please, the reality is very complex.
That is certainly true of what I would say about your first question. So absolutely, there are continuities that you can trace from the Cold War through to the present. So just to give a couple of obvious examples, some of the patriotic narratives, such as the abiding focus on the importance of World War II, have endured through much of the Soviet period and have been revived, albeit in a slightly different form today. The idea of a degenerate, failing West with collapse imminent, that you found examples of, certainly in the late Soviet period, have again acquired new steam under Putin. The sort of the anti-Western, particularly anti-American sentiment, the grinning face of American imperialism, which was a trope that you would find under Brezhnev. Again, almost word for word, you'll find a variance of nowadays, and the return, or if it ever went away, of what we used to call Ura management. So, hooray, hooray, hooray! Everything is good. Everything is functioning. The people are living well. Things are getting better. Let's not talk about the negative aspects of life, and so all of those things, variants of, have persisted, and in many ways have acquired new steam under Putin, and particularly since February 2022. However, there are many important differences. The two fundamental ones, and again, they're fairly obvious when you think about it. First of all, the Soviet Union, whatever you thought about it, it did have a unifying ideology, a holistic unifying ideology, that of Marxism-Leninism. And Russia does not have that unifying ideology, other than this kind of empty, inflated, puffed up patriotism, opportunistic and incoherent. So that makes a difference to what can be said, what is said, and how it's said. And the second big difference, again, I'm stating the obvious here, is that we now live, and Russia lives, in a globally interconnected world, in which it is much less easy, if at all possible, to control flows of information in the way that it was through much of the Soviet period. Now that latter point offers certain advantages to Russia, but it also presents threats and dangers, and how Russia goes about managing that tension accounts for a lot of what it is doing in the information sphere. So it is taking advantage of our digitally connected world in a way that simply wasn't possible under the Soviets, but it is also having to act and react in a way that it wasn't required to do under the Soviets, where the population could be protected, quote unquote, from undesirable information, undesirable narratives. That is no longer possible to the extent that it was then, and that changes the way that Russia operates in this environment. I can give you
the messages when sorry, when you and I were talking about this event. You mentioned that you have noticed a big difference in how the West was portrayed and Western culture during the Soviet times and now. Could you be more specific?
Well, yes, I think the conversation you're referring to, I was harking back to the times that I spent in the Soviet Union, and again, I hesitate to draw exact parallels, but certainly the period when I spent most of my time in the Soviet Union was a sort of late Brezhnev period, when already there was a kind of, well, first of all, there was a great deal of curiosity about the West. Huge curiosity, admiration, interest, an attempt to engage with Western culture, and I'm talking not just about the popular level, but even at the official level. A lot of interest in Western literature, Western film. A grudging respect. Yes, ideologically they were enemies, but the extent to which you witnessed what I would now call a visceral hatred was simply not on show in that late Soviet period. Now it is a almost tangible, visceral antipathy, hatred that is being whipped up from the top and the bottom. So remember, the other thing you have to remember is that propaganda works, yes, from the top down, but particularly now in the digital era, there is a bottom-up element to it. And the two of them in Russia at the moment are converging in this unifying anti-Western antipathy, hatred that I don't remember seeing or experiencing throughout the times that I spent in the Soviet Union, notwithstanding the rivalry, the ideological disagreements and standoffs. So that's a real difference. And I think it actually goes back to what I was saying earlier, or at least goes back in part to the lack of ideology. When you don't have a thought through, coherent, inclusive, all-embracing political ideology, what do you have to fall back on? You have to fall back on identity narratives. And that's what Russia now has replaced that ideological set of narratives with. It's replacing them with a set of identity narratives.
Could you sort of explain those identity narratives? What do they mean exactly? Is it which values do these identity narratives have, or it is only versus the West that they acquire certain value or characteristics?
Well, it's very much in opposition. So the West is very much the other. In fact, Russian propaganda refers repeatedly now to kollektivny Zapad, the collective West. And Russia defines itself against this collective West. The way it portrays this collective West is in terms of values. So Russia is the defender of traditional values, conservative values of family, of religion, of faith, whereas the West is the home of degenerate narratives of gender, feminism, LGBTQ, and liberal. It's very, very much anti-liberal. So liberalism is the curse of the world, and Russia defines itself as being against all that liberal democracy stands for.
Or in other words, Russia represents Europe, the best of Europe from some centuries ago.
Yeah. So now, of course, it won't be lost on anyone here that anti-liberal values narratives are not unique to Russia. You'll find them in the West. You'll particularly find them on the far right in America, but also elsewhere, including in Europe. And so that, of course, creates opportunities for Russian propagandists to create networks of collusion and collaboration, but also legitimation, so that they can portray these identity narratives as having support not only in Russia, but also elsewhere in the liberal world.
This brings me to two questions. One is, as a non-Russian speaker, but who does look at certain clips from Russian television on Twitter with English subtitles, the narrative that is so aggressive. And I wonder, what is the purpose? It is not only, if I mention one of the propagandists that I am aware of, Solovyov, I even heard him speak how death is good, how you should go to war. It is a celebration of death. It is a celebration of sacrifice, and it is a sort of a competition. Where do we throw the bomb? How far do we throw the bomb and destroy Europe? And I guess do you remember anything similar that you have experienced before? Is this new? And what is the real impact of this? Could you put it in the context, please?
Yeah, so this I would say is new. So, however, what one does have to make a distinction between the official line that you tend to get out of the national news broadcasts and these talk shows, which are used as in a way, a sort of laboratory where the most extreme and outrageous ideas can be created and fostered and allowed to bubble, and where the extreme ideas that come from the grassroots can find their way into the public forum. And this has happened, which really began, I think probably it began before, it began from 2012 onwards. 2012, the presidential election, Putin was shocked by the level of protests. If you remember, there were huge protests against what was seen as a fake election. And the regime was clearly spooked. And since then, there has been an attempt to really ramp up propaganda, less through the news, but through these talk shows, which whip up the kinds of sentiments that are able to quell the sort of elements of resistance and suffocate and suppress them. But since the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2022, it's been on another level entirely. And you really have seen statements that, no, it really isn't an exaggeration to call genocidal hatred. But once again, there's sometimes a mistake is making in taking what is said on these talk shows as official Kremlin policy. Sometimes it is, and let's not forget that official Kremlin policy is itself extreme and outrageous, and even within the regime, you have Dmitry Medvedev, who's kind of now he's changed his role. He was a lapdog, and now he's turned into an attack dog. So some of the most outrageous statements from the regime will come from Medvedev, who recently talked about Odessa, Kharkiv, Kiev. They're Russian cities, like many others, and they're just temporarily occupied, and we're going to get them back. But on the talk shows, this genocidal language is taken to a new level entirely.
What do you think? Excuse me for interrupting. What do you think will be the impact on the audience of this new level of content or aggressiveness or whatever?
Well, you have to remember that there's still a large segment of the population do get their news and information from television, though it is largely the older segment of the population. So those over, I don't know, 50, 60 will rely very much on television. Younger than that, they're much more kind of internet savvy, and the alternative narratives that Russia is, concerned about are much more readily available. But well, what is the purpose of these talk shows now? I think they serve several purposes. So the kind of statement you were referring to, sometimes it takes the form of a kind of interstate trolling. So they're fully well aware that you and I and others are noting and monitoring what is being said, and rather than restrain their language, they turn it up a notch. One of the worst offenders is Margarita Simonyan, the CEO of Russia Today, who has called for the mass murder of Ukrainians on more than one occasion. But if she's doing it as a deliberate provocation, so one function is that of deliberate, in-your-face, interstate trolling provocation. It is also a way of making sure that this anti-Western sentiment stays solid. So it's whipping up hatred, making sure that the population, that element of the population that listens and watches television remains opposed to the West in all its aspects. It is also, thirdly, a way of kind of filtering from the bottom up those grassroots nationalist sentiments that the regime thinks might be useful to it, even if it doesn't necessarily embrace them fully itself. And fourthly, despite the fact that Putin and Medvedev are themselves making the most outrageous statements, the really genocidal acts of trolling that I've been describing have the effect of making Putin seem sensible, calm, moderate, and reasonable. So they when you watch them, your impression is utter chaos, hatred, uncontrolled, visceral kind of hatred. But they do serve a number of very useful functions to the propaganda operation as a whole.
Russian propaganda, not only Russian, encompasses many, many channels. To what extent, you that have been studying it for so many years, to what extent are all these messages, all these channels coordinated? Do they all come from one place, or there is sort of a competition who is more patriotic, so let's outdo it? How does it work?
Well, there's I think two things. Well, there's many things, but I'll say two things. I first of all, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there has been a noted or notable centralization of control. So up until then, yes, the Kremlin controlled state television and state media output, but it allowed for a degree of journalistic license, so that, and there was good reason for that, because journalists, if they know their trade, they understand better which narratives work best for which segments of the population, and they were able to play an active role in kind of shaping the propaganda, and that did sometimes lead to differentiation between channels and between journalists, albeit within the framework of a set of themes that were agreed on a weekly basis in what appeared to have been a genuine dialogue between the Kremlin and the sort of leading channel top dogs. So it was a kind of negotiated agenda that you would get between the television channels and the Kremlin, and then enacted with differences across the different channels. Since 2022, that has effectively disappeared, and the Kremlin has taken a much more rigid and central control of the agenda and of the narratives. That said, the other point I want to make is that yes, the control is as close to absolute as you can get, but the narratives themselves can be very inconsistent and incoherent. And in a way, that's not surprising because,
Please give an example.
well, I can give several examples. So first of all, the narratives have shifted and changed as the war has endured. So, you know, from the very start, the probably the dominant narrative was denazification.
What does that
Ukraine,
mean, really?
well, the idea that Ukraine has been seized by remnants of the Nazi elements of the population that have always been there lurking, and now they've seized control, and the regime has been Nazified. And that you very much still get that narrative. It hasn't gone away, but I think the Kremlin rapidly realized that a lot of people didn't believe it. It wasn't terribly persuasive. You have to remember that Russians and Ukrainians know one another. They've visited one another's countries. Many Russians have Ukrainians in their families. The idea that Ukraine has been fully Nazified, yes, I mean it might work in some instances with some elements of the population, but it wasn't terribly effective, and it has given way somewhat to what has proved two much more effective narratives, although they're in tension with one another. One is that of decolonization. So it's Russia that needs decolonizing. Russia has been colonized by the West. And the West is seeking to bring Russia back into its imperial dominance, and has been trying to do so since the 19th century. The idea of Russia as being victim of a colonizer wasn't created by Putin. Variants of that narrative you can trace to the 19th century in the Slavophiles. And that's important because these historical narratives have long duration, therefore they resonate. They seem true to people. And so this idea that Russia is under attack, the West wants it for its own colonial dominion, and the Ukraine is just a pawn being used, a stepping stone to the dismantling and the seizing of Russia. That has become much more vocally, I think, articulated than the denazification, which is repeated over and over again, but it's less persuasive and less dominant. But the other one is, and you may say, well, how can these two sit alongside one another? Is Russia itself as the great imperial power. Russia is a great power. That's in the kind of acceptable form. There are great powers. America is a great power. Britain was a great power, isn't any longer. Russia was and is a great power. And what it is doing is protecting its great power interests. But then a little further along the spectrum is Russia as an empire. Historical Russia. Russia has always historically been an empire, and should re-establish its imperial dominion over Ukraine and certainly the Slavic elements of the ex-Soviet Union, and that too resonates. So you have these, in a sense, two opposing narratives. Russia is a victim of colonization. Russia is itself a great imperial power.
As you say, the reality is always very complex. I see the time is running. May I, before I open the floor, there are a couple of things. When we said that, I'll ask three questions, one after the other. When we were talking about the narrative portraying Russia as a true European, as a place of true European values of several centuries ago, I'm just wondering, to what extent are those European politicians who accept to be interviewed, or American who accept to be interviewed by Russian propaganda TVs, to what extent are they useful? To what extent should one accept these invitations? Or that's one question. The second question is, it's slightly different. I know there is, are we exaggerating the impact? This is the other angle of Russian propaganda in Europe. And the third one, all very complex, is considering what you have told us about the content of the current Russian propaganda for the domestic audience. Well, the war will end one day and the narrative will have to change. How long does it take to change the narrative and people's minds according to your studies? These are very simple questions, and then please prepare yours for Professor Hutchings.
Well, I'll be as quick as I can, given that we need to allow time for questions. Yes, I mean, you were referring in your first question to the infamous Tucker Carlson, I'm assuming, and his.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. You have Austrian former Minister of Foreign Affairs appears in Russia. It's not Tucker Carlson. It's a lot longer than that.
I mean, they are extremely useful to the Kremlin because they offer a form of legitimation, and which is why Tucker Carlson's interview was covered sort of extensively and triumphantly on Russian television, as are other interviews with Western media figures and politicians. So I think they should think very, very carefully. I mean, Tucker Carlson is a case in himself. I mean, he is an example of that interface, that convergence between the far right and authoritarian states like Russia. That is worrying. I mean, that is an area in which the degree of confluence and mutual influence is genuine and is a concern. I would never accept I have been invited onto Russian television, and I've always said no, and the question wouldn't even arise in my mind now. And I think probably I think probably most certainly most academics and most mainstream politicians would, to be fair to European politicians, would say the same. As to impact, I go back to my sort of initial cautionary note. It's complex. I don't think Russian propaganda has been terribly effective in shaping mainstream Western opinion, either before the bans imposed or after. It's fallen on deaf ears largely. However, there are elements within the Western public opinion, for example, the far right, which I've referred to before, where there is very definitely a degree of mutual influence. It goes two ways, you see. There are certain pockets within the West, so your own Serbia is a case in point. Other East European countries, most recently Poland, people have become slightly concerned by Russian propaganda influence in Poland, which is interesting because Poland has historically been very kind of anti-Russian in its stances. But where the influence is, I think, much more serious and significant is in what we sometimes misleadingly refer to as the global South. Not throughout the global South, but there are certainly large areas that are much more receptive, particularly to the narrative that I didn't mention, that of not Russia on its own, but Russia as leading an alliance of anti-imperial, anti-hegemonic forces, establishing a multipolar world. So it's linked to that Russia as victim of imperialism or colonialism, and it allows Russia to make connections with populations in Latin America, particularly in Africa. Africa is a real focus for Russian propaganda at the moment. Middle East, even India to some extent. Those areas are receptive, particularly to this anti-hegemonic, anti-American narrative that the global South is being ignored, dumbed down, and the idea that all this sort of upset and outrage about Ukraine is hypocritical. It's just another Western war. The West is being utterly hypocritical. Now, that doesn't necessarily amount to support for Russia, but it does allow Russia to negate and neutralize the Western account of the war in those regions. And that I think is important, and that's something to be concerned about. I think a lot of specialists are particularly concerned about Africa at the moment.
And just very briefly, how long does it take to undo propaganda narrative and the impact?
Well, as we were discussing, I think before we became on air, so to speak, those that have studied propaganda from the beginnings, including in the West, generally come to the conclusion that propaganda is often actually not very effective at changing people's minds. Certainly state propaganda doesn't often do a very good job in actually changing the mind of someone who is opposed to something to get them to support it. What it is good at doing, what it has been used to do, is to consolidate and reinforce and stir up in support the views and the sentiments of the either loyal population or those elements of the population that are open to supporting the official line. And so the answer to your question is, it won't take very long at all for those who are doubtful about, or let alone opposed to the war, to have their minds changed, because they never change their minds anyway. Those who support the war in Russia, I mean, the picture is now very complex. It's very difficult to get reliable opinion surveys out of Russia now, but to the best that we can tell, the active support for the war has dropped significantly. What I think probably does remain the case is that a lot of people are either wanting to turn a blind eye to it, not think about it, or reluctantly supporting it, though the numbers of people who just want it all to end appears to be growing. How long it will take to wind down and eradicate this visceral anti-Western feeling, I don't know. I'm optimistic. You see, Russian propaganda is extremely opportunistic. It seizes on those stories, those accounts that work for it and that it needs in a particular context, and then abandons them because it doesn't have this unifying worldview. And so I'm, perhaps naively optimistic that when the time comes, this vicious anti-Western, anti-liberal sentiment will evaporate. But I could be wrong. I'm not sure. I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Well, are there any questions? You can just you can turn on the camera. You can turn on your cameras and just go ahead, raise your hand and turn on the camera, and I'll give the word.
Okay, hi, yes, Ulla. I don't know, I think my camera is not working. I tried to
Just a second.
Yeah.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Of course. My name is Ulla Ebner. I'm working for the public national radio channel Ö1 for a program called Digital Life. And this is why my question refers to that. We talked a lot about propaganda and influence via television and other channels, but I would be very curious to learn more about the Russian methods to use the internet and social media for the propaganda, and especially nowadays as we have those new possibilities via artificial intelligence. So I would like to learn a little bit more about that aspect.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Stephen?
Yes, I mean that's an important question, and it goes back to an answer I gave to Mariana, though I didn't develop that the fact that we live in a digitally connected world gives new opportunities to Russian propagandists that weren't available before, but also does represent threats. So as to the opportunities, well, again, there's so much I could say, but let me mention two things. One, it does give Russian propagandists more of an opportunity, more of a chance to penetrate Western media space unnoticed or unobserved. So, you can set up proxy websites, Anglophone English websites, that do then engage in a sort of collaborative dialogue with sympathetic elements in the far right, without them necessarily being recognized as Kremlin sponsored or even Kremlin sympathetic. You have the infamous trolls who can astroturf American social media space and pretend to be outraged young Americans protesting against the state of affairs in America, using the very language of the far right. So this kind of participatory grassroots element of the digital revolution can work very much in favor of Russian propaganda. So a second example, and again, I could have said much more about this, because we are interconnected. Russia is much more attentive to Western discourses. So, for example, what we're talking about now, propaganda and disinformation. Don't think that Russian propagandists aren't also engaging in and using this language of propaganda and disinformation. It is now one of the most sort of potent and frequent put downs of what we're saying. It's disinformation, it's propaganda. Moreover, the grassroots digital element of it allows them to set up, there's a website, for example, called War on Fakes. Its content is in both English and Russian, and it is ostensibly set up by ordinary Russians who are concerned about the untruths and the disinformation out there. And their task as true participatory Democrats is to call out and unpick and deconstruct disinformation. Interestingly, or they're following the Kremlin account almost line by line. And yet there's nothing to link them tangibly to the Kremlin. So they're using this kind of on the one hand, participatory democracy, the idea that digital media allows you and me to contribute to the public debate in a way that wasn't the case before. So they're using that combined with these discourses of fake news, disinformation, propaganda, and that, that is actually quite an effective weapon. So on the one hand, it is serving them very well, but at the same time, because we're so digitally interconnected, it is virtually impossible for Russia to protect its population from inconvenient accounts, events that they don't want the population to know about, people they don't want to hear from. It's almost impossible. And so what they're having to do now is engage in much more systematic, detailed rebuttal. I happened to watch the perhaps the most well-known, one of the most well-known propaganda talk show on Friday, I think it was, Vremya Pokaže, Time Will Tell. And it was reporting on Putin's State of the Nation address the evening before. And interesting that half of the program began, was taken up with extensive quotes from CNN, from France 24, France 24, from BBC. All of these extensive quotes from all the big mainstream Western channels, and it attempted to rebut and ridicule and mock them one by one by one. That would never, ever have happened in the Soviet period, but they feel they have to engage in this instant rebuttal because of the digital connectedness. So it represents a threat. And how the balance between threat and opportunity play out is actually very interesting and difficult to call.
Thank you, Stephen.
Can I ask a very short follow-up?
No, sorry, no, there is another person.
Okay.
Kadri, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Kadri Liik. I work for European Council on Foreign Relations, focusing on Russia, and this season I'm conducting a research with IWM on a very related topic, Russian society during Soviet times and now. And one thing that keeps puzzling me, and I don't properly have an answer. I mean, in Soviet era, there were personalities or even institutions in the society that could challenge the Kremlin and its narratives, kind of moral authority that offered some counterweight. I mean, you would find lots of that among creative intelligentsia, but also among scientists, etc. There were very sort of prominent figures, and they're not there today. And I wonder, why is that? To what extent is it because the level of repression today, I mean, wartime rules, to what extent is it because power in Russia is concentrated much more than it was in the Soviet times into a single pair of hands? I mean, Soviet era was more pluralistic, also institutionally. Or to what extent it's something other, something to do with the society or overall the era we live in, that it doesn't produce that kind of figures any longer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I not to avoid I think there is elements of everything that you've said that are true. The Soviet regime, what was, as you say, it was fully embedded throughout Russian society. It was structured. There were institutions, and inevitably, over a period of time, these institutions did develop rivalries with one another, and you got alternative voice. So journalism, for example, the Soviet journalists, yes, they were restricted in their operation and what they could do and write and say, but they were taught to think of themselves as professionals. And they were taught the values of the journalistic ethos, albeit, in a Marxist-Leninist framework. And little by little, they began to think of themselves primarily as professionals rather than as servants of the state. Because if you're a professional, by very nature, by in terms of your identity, you think of yourself as doing a serious job, a serious role, not as a pawn of the state. And so you did get differentiation in view and opinion in a way that, yes, today does not seem to be the case. You do have to. I'm going to say something that might sound slightly controversial. We perhaps shouldn't draw too many conclusions about the state of Russian society based on what is happening now, because through its own aggression and error, Russia is at war. And societies and states of war act differently. They behave differently. I mean, I don't want to draw completely inappropriate parallels, but I don't think you can generalize about Israel now, based on the state of affairs in Israel at war in Gaza. I mean, the way that the regime is behaving then is different from the way it was behaving before. I'm old enough to remember the stupid little imperial war that Britain fought in the Falklands back in 1981, which was reported very well in Europe, very sensibly, and in a very balanced fashion. In Britain, it was wall-to-wall war propaganda. And that was a silly little war, and 1,000 miles away in islands that most British people had never heard of until the war started. So I think some of the things that you noted, they are there and they will re-emerge. When the war finally comes to an end, the worrying thing is, of course, that the exodus of thinking Russians, particularly young Russians, and that is worrying for the future of the Russian economy, but it's also worrying for the future of the Russian public sphere, where all the sort of intelligent, thinking, educated, critical Russians no longer feel they're able to contribute to that society, and they've gone elsewhere.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to take a few questions now together. Yeah. So first, Andras Nemeth, then Fabian Schmidt, and then Javier Luque, and then you, Ola, because it's the second question. Andras, please introduce yourself. Take 4, and then Andras, please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Andras Nemeth. I'm a journalist from Hungary, and I don't have the camera, unfortunately. Something wrong with my laptop. My question would be, because Kadri has mentioned that the oppression is increasing. Is it true now? What do you think? That is Russia turned into an open dictatorship from authoritarian state, or so? How would you describe Russia today as a state?
Thank you, Andras. Fabian, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Fabian Schmidt. I'm lead investigative reporter at Austrian daily Der Standard, and I wanted to ask you about your opinion of Vladislav Surkov, his influence, and if he has fallen out of favor with the Kremlin, and why that is, in your opinion.
Thank you. Javier Luque, please introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Javier Luque. I work for the International Press Institute. Here we are conducting a series of investigations together with other journalists across Europe on disinformation and propaganda against journalists and news organizations. My question is, you mentioned this specific case of the TV show where, the news, the headlines of BBC, New York Times, etc., were being ridiculed. My question is, what other, narratives have you observed against the press?
Thank you. And Ola, very fast.
Okay, yeah, it was a follow-up question to what we talked before. I would be curious, what happened to Prigozhin's troll factories after Prigozhin's death? Are they still working somehow, or are they closed down?
Perfect.
So, thank you
so much. Okay, go ahead, Stephen. 4 easy questions.
Well, no, there are actually four complicated questions. The first one is, of course, a very important one. What kind of state is Russia now? I have to say I'm not a political scientist. There are people who are much better trained to answer that question. It's and again, you know, Russia is at war, and wars do change the way that states behave. But certainly, based on what you can observe now, Russia is absolutely a brutal dictatorship. And also, I would add that there are, and this I thought I'd never see in Russia, there are elements of the return of what I would call not even dictatorship, but totalitarianism. So the cult of reporting on one's neighbor, which was integral to the functioning of the Soviet state, the whole network, everyone, the idea that you report on your neighbor if she or he says something untoward was accepted. That's just the way you are, the way you behave, and that has returned, albeit perhaps not quite on the same scale. The militarization of young people. Young people are now being, we didn't talk about this aspect of propaganda, military patriotic education from the primary school, even younger, onwards. That is happening now. So these are elements not of a dictatorship, but of a totalitarian regime. As I say, I caution to say that can this last beyond the duration of the war? That I'm not sure. I would think not. I would think not. But based on what we observe now, it's not authoritarian. It's not even dictatorship. It's on the pathway to totalitarianism. But as I say, it is at war. What was the second? Surkov, yeah, he slips in and out of the picture. He was very important and very influential in the early part of Putin's period in power. It was he who supposedly developed the theory of sovereignty, the idea of Russia as a sovereign democracy, developed a whole theory behind that, which has now kind of fallen into disuse somewhat. It was he also who is accredited with having developed the whole kind of armory of post-truth narratives, post-truth devices, which were and still are very, very important in the way that Russia does disinformation. It's very often not to lie outright, not to tell lies, although it does tell outright lies, but to confuse and to, you know, circulate multiple different versions so that everyone ends up saying, I don't know where the truth is. It could be anything. But then he fell out of favor and was actually sacked. But apparently he has regained favor and has been active in shaping the Russian propaganda activities in the Donbass and in occupied Ukraine. So he's a mysterious figure who slips in and out of the shadows. Someone asked about narratives against the press. Yeah. Well, here, and presumably you're referring to the Western press, and here again is another example of where Putin, you see, the Kremlin is quite adept in learning from the West as well as attacking it. So it has learned the narratives of the Trump forces on the American right, anti-mainstream, the establishment, the deep state. The deep state is listed by the US State Department as one of Russia's 5 top disinformation narratives for the Ukraine war. The American deep state is collaborating with elements of the Nazi regime in Ukraine to set up weapons factories. So the deep state, of course, not a Russian narrative. It's one that they've borrowed and adopted and adapted for their own purposes, as is that of the CNN and the mainstream Western media as part of a powerful deep state establishment. Yeah, so again, it's the regime as a learner as well as a teacher. And then the troll factory, it is apparent that the troll factory is still alive and well, and under different management, particularly in Africa. Yes, clearly there was a fallout between Prigozhin and Putin, and we all know how that ended. But Prigozhin was very, very useful to Putin, and particularly the networks that he'd established in Africa. And Putin did not want to let that slip. So Prigozhin's whole operation, including his troll factory, is very, very much still active. And you wouldn't have thought that there'd been a change in management. And to some extent, as far as Africa is concerned, it's become even more active.
Thank you. I can take one more question because we are out of time. You wanted to say something else, Fabian? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about how Kadyrov is styled as a example for Muslims within Russia and also outside of Russia globally. What's your take on that?
Kadyrov, yes. Well, Kadyrov has been a big supporter of Putin and of the war, although interestingly, as the war has worn on, he's tended to he's on occasion being critical, but along the lines that the war is not going well, and that the Russian army needs to toughen up and assert itself more, and that the generals in charge are not doing a good job, and that he, Kadyrov, would do a much better job. Remember that the Chechens and also minorities from the North Caucasus and elsewhere in Russia are a very, very large part of the war effort. That's an important dimension to the war that we haven't talked about, but mustn't forget that the large components of the Russian army are from the North Caucasus and from some of the other non-Russian republics in the Far East. And so they feel, legitimately one might say, they feel that they have a stake in this war, and that they're keen that it's conducted in their interests. So Kadyrov is potentially a threat. He's been loyal, he's been well served by Putin and has served well in return. But if one wants to speculate about, the future, then it's possible that Kadyrov could end up playing a role in the post-Putin settlement, whatever it is. And I don't think he's going to play a very sort of positive role as far as we're concerned.
Thank you. We are 4 minutes past, 2 or 3 more minutes, and then we shall have to go. Melita Sunic, now I take the last one. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Melita Šunić, and I'm devising campaigns. So attitude change and the impact of campaigns is somehow my topic. And I had the feeling that you were downplaying a bit what propaganda does to Russian society, saying that those who are not convinced about Putin's policy will not be convinced by the propaganda. And I am a bit, I don't quite agree. And my question is, if we look at the narratives, you said Putin is trying to present himself as the most reasonable against those very extreme positions that are being used in social media and on TV. But all opposition that we have seen in the past years against Putin was not a more liberal stance, but in fact a more radical stance. If we look at Nadeždin, if we look at Prigozhin, even Navalny in his first years, in the past years, he grew more liberal and more pro-Western, but he also started out with a very, very conservative Russian imperialist narrative. So I am wondering whether this gin that's out of the bottle will not, maybe after Putin we will not be able to put him back into the bottle.
Thank you, Melita.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and you know, this is why I was mentioning Kadyrov as a possible player in the post-Putin era. Yes, one assumes that once Putin is gone, or one would like to believe that when Putin is gone, suddenly Russia will enjoy a kind of Maidan-style democratic revolution and be replaced by a sort of friendly democratic regime that we can all get along with. That's possible, but it's very unlikely. More likely is, as you say, for the still more extreme elements to coalesce around an agenda that is more extreme, more nationalist than Putin. And that's what I meant. I'm sorry, I may not have put this as clearly as I should. That's what I meant by saying that the propaganda is useful, persuasive, helpful, impactful in those components of the population and the public sphere that are already open to that kind of narratives, and that would include nationalists. And let's not forget that these elements they far predate Putin. They go back certainly into the Soviet period and arguably into the 19th century. So you know, you mentioned Navalny and his views. Let's not forget that Solzhenitsyn, who was the hero of the West, the dissident hero fighting against Soviet oppression, it was Solzhenitsyn who first talked about an expanded Russian nation to include Ukraine, Belarus, and Solzhenitsyn wanted parts of Kazakhstan as well. So the idea that it was Putin who created these stories, these imperial accounts, is not the case. They have a long duration. And the fact that Putin and his regime is now promoting them just makes sure that, you know, they are revived among those people, those figures, those segments of the population among whom they've continued to resonate for decades, if not centuries. So yes, propaganda in that sense has created a sort of Frankenstein's monster. What I meant was that it's not, or it's much less likely to change the opinion of those who were critical of the regime and of that very nationalist version of patriotism from the very outset.
I want to thank you so much, Stephen. I thank you all for participating. I am afraid this is the beginning of a talk. I think we shall have to continue this conversation. And I would like to stay with Stephen's optimism that things can change, even if at our age we know they may not change. But we also know that countries fall apart and regimes fall apart, and we never thought it would be possible. But I would like just to finish with one thought as a question. How come that Russia knows about the West a lot more than the West knows about Russia? How come that Russia is we worry about Russian propaganda, and Russians do not worry as much, I think, about Western propaganda? Or they do not worry as much as the West. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the knowledge of one side to the other is bigger. What do you say?
I wouldn't say that Russia doesn't worry about Western propaganda. A lot of the strategies that I've talked about
Come from the West. So we are
precisely
learning from each other.
precisely to stop them penetrating. I mean, someone asked a question about the digital world we live in now. Well, one technique, or among the techniques that the regime is having to deploy, is the use of algorithmic propaganda, the way of controlling, shaping algorithms so that the inconvenient Western narratives simply don't penetrate or aren't prominent. There's a cat and mouse game between the Kremlin and the, particularly young people who are technically savvy and can use VPNs to circumvent the blocks and make sure they do get access to alternative accounts. So, it's cat and mouse. The Kremlin find new technologies to block VPNs, and those who are keen to access the narratives find methods of circumventing in a constant cat and mouse game. So I think Russia is worried about Western narratives, and that is why it's behaving as it does. It's paranoid. It believes it's being colonized from within and from without, and that paranoia is normally driven by fear.
And so we fear each other, and we shall continue. At least what you have helped us a lot is to understand the complexity of the topic, and we shall continue the conversation. Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank everybody else.
Thank you, and thank you for all the excellent questions as well.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.